New Buddha Way Dharma Talks. Geoff Hunt presents a talk on some aspect of the Buddha's teaching.
Well, hello everyone. Good to see you despite the snow. Well, today we're going to talk about something which is at the other end of the scale. But I think it's something very important, especially in the kind of society we live in. And that is the emotion of guilt, which is a very painful thing to carry around. The whole family of concepts here: blame, contrition, shame, repentance. One of the things I want to, or the main thing really, the main point I want to make is to distinguish between guilt and remorse. It's rather an artificial distinction. I wouldn't take it too seriously, but it's helpful to get us to understand what is going on with the emotion of guilt. One meditation teacher, I think her name is Salzberg, I can't remember the name now, an American teacher. She says this, that, quote, guilt, as opposed to remorse, is a negative, paralyzing emotion based on non-acceptance of oneself, that is, rejection of oneself, or the situation one is in. And it can lead to depression and frustration rather than change or improvement, close quote. I thought I'd quote that because it's really puts everything in a nutshell. I'll read it again because it's so important to understand this helpful distinction between remorse and guilt. By the way, there is a sort of neutral sense of guilt in which you're just guilty of having done something as opposed to being innocent. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the feeling of being guilty, of having done wrong, of having hurt someone. So that teacher says, guilt as opposed to remorse is a negative, paralyzing emotion based on non-acceptance of oneself or the situation one is in. And it leads to depression, or it can lead to depression and frustration, rather than change or improvement. So, mainly thinking of cases in which one has hurt someone deliberately or through negligence, or possibly through compliance with what others are doing at the time. Of course, if one's society is taking the wrong path, for example, into war, then one may get carried along with that. One may get carried along with ideologies. It's very difficult if one's family or one's group is doing wrong, because then it becomes very difficult sometimes to see what is wrong and what is right. So we can all get caught up when we reflect that I shouldn't have been involved in that, or I shouldn't have done that, or I couldn't help but to do that at the time. Now, to carry that around is very painful, of course. So what we're talking about is how to look at that in a way which helps us out of the paralyzing emotion that is guilt. I think all of us, will have experienced this emotion to some degree or another. And I think the older one gets, the more one piles up guilts of various degree. Some are very light guilts, others are really paralyzing. The opposite of this would be shamelessness or no conscience. Now let's talk about remorse for a moment. Remorse is where one has done something wrong and one now is going to learn something from it, so it becomes positive. Guilt in itself is nothing but negative. It's just paralyzing. It's just a weight that one carries around. Whereas remorse is, what have I learned from this? Where do I go from here? Okay. Now, there are some people, for one reason or another, that are not very good on feeling remorse. And at an extreme case, it could be words that we might use would be someone with no conscience or someone who is shameless. When I worked at the prison for a year, I did meet some prisoners who you felt were like that it didn't matter to them if they hurt others. In fact, some quite enjoyed it. Others just didn't seem to really understand what all the fuss was about. And there were those who situation was remediable in the sense that they knew that they had done wrong and they wish they hadn't. Okay. There's a whole nest of different concepts here: shamelessness, no conscience, etc., etc., etc. So guilt in this negative sense is unhelpful. One keeps coming back to it. Sometimes this can go on for years or even decades. And it has led some people even to taking their own lives. It can be that serious a weight. But for most of us, there are little guilts. Maybe the time we shouted at our partner or our friend over something, and then later we think, well, why was I shouting? Now, this is relatively minor. Just go along and apologize, and that's hopefully that is that. But there are those who have been engaged in crime, in wars, who have suffered as much from the guilt as they have from the wartime experience itself. This, if you haven't experienced that, I suppose it could be rather difficult to understand. Because from the outside, one always thinks, well, okay, that happened, you did that, you're aware of it, why not just drop it? Unfortunately, it's not quite as easy as that. There's this issue of attachment. One becomes attached to the wrong one has done, and it's very sticky, and one does not seem to be able to get rid of it. So remorse, now let's think of remorse. Remorse is typical of Buddhism, to turn something around and make something good out of it. Remorse is the pain that comes to you from having hurt someone. And this now is remedied by mindfulness and an attitude of compassion. So remorse, it comes as a surprise to some people, could be seen as positive and helpful. And of course, if one is the person who is living with someone else who feels remorse or has taken pain from someone, then they may go on reminding the person of that. And then it's a question about what is the point of that? And how does one deal with that? So virtue, on the one hand is the person who does the hurt, on the other hand is the person that's been hurt. Now that raises another complication, because when one has been hurt and one feels indignation and pain, what one is now carrying around is a grudge. That's the simple Anglo-Saxon word for it, a grudge. So a grudge is when someone's hurt you and you're carrying that around. And remorse or guilt in the negative, is when you have hurt someone and now you regret that. Human life is very complicated, isn't it? It really is a stew pot of all sorts of things. And it's a funny thing how these things come to the mind when maybe we see someone else getting into this sort of situation, or maybe just looking at a film and that situation arises. It's a common human theme. And then it pops again. Or one is trying to get off to sleep, and then that pops up this ugly little head again. And it can also cause repetition of tension between the two parties. So every so often it comes up again. It seem sticky, it's like a flypaper. It won't go away. So let's, it's an important issue, because we talk so much about, like last week actually, about suffering. Well, this is suffering. This is an example of suffering. Just think of that. What is suffering? Suffering isn't having a toothache or a boil. Suffering is inward. It's often connected with feelings of negativity or even hatred for oneself. That's not a good place to be in, and it's not a fruitful place to be in. It leads into nowhere except a dark alley. Okay. Now, when we think about this more widely, we can ask ourselves a question whether society itself raises false expectations of oneself. And one therefore is put in a position very often of chasing success, chasing power, acquisitiveness, that is wanting more stuff, doing things in order to get these, which hurt other people. That's the point. Maybe society seems to have set us up so that hurting other people is okay. I was just trying to get ahead in my job and you got in the way. Sorry about that, but has to be done. I've actually heard this sort of thing quite a lot in my lifetime. So it could be a wider social issue in that it rests on certain expectations of a person. That we don't want to feel a failure, for example. Therefore, we do some outlandish, hurtful things in order to get ahead. Now, again, it's very common. And then once we've done that, we may see that we've lost a friend as a result of it. Now the friend is carrying a grudge and you're carrying guilt. Not a happy situation, is it? No. Some people think that you have to be hard on yourself. You have to sort of punish yourself to get ahead. So you do things or say things which you know are hurtful, but think, well, I've got to suffer the guilt of that because I really have to get ahead. It's a feature of our society. Now, there are many people who claim, and they may be right, think about it for yourself, that we live in a civilization based on Christian ideas, and that original sin or evil is at the bottom of human life. That is how we are. Now, if that is how we are originally, sinful, it's not surprising if brought up in that environment, one carries around a lot of guilt because one is never good enough. But whether I want to lay that at the door of Christianity or not, I'm not quite sure. I'll let you think about it. The idea of original sin. Now, it is true to say that having traveled the world, I don't find that sort of thought pattern going on in, say, the Far East, in Japan or China. They don't quite understand what you mean. In West Africa, I didn't really see this preoccupation with guilt. If you raised it often for a discussion, people will often laugh their heads off. They think, why are you beating yourself up? But I don't know. It's a large issue. All I'm saying is there is a social dimension to this issue. There's also the issue of how we bring our children up. If we blame our children for this, that, and everything, and give them the idea that they are bad rather than what they did is bad, then you're going to have someone growing up to be a person carrying a lot of guilt. You see what I mean? So, correcting a child, make it clear that it is the act that wasn't very clever or skillful. That's something you shouldn't do, but not that you are bad, not that the child is bad. So you don't condemn a child with the phrase, you are bad. You did the wrong thing, definitely. Right, that's clear. Then there is the question of how do you deal with the guilt of the other? That's somebody else's guilt. Somebody else feels guilty. They bring it to you. You talk about it. They want to talk about it a lot. It's almost getting obsessive. How do you deal with that? It's not good enough just to say, "Oh, stop worrying about that. Forget about that." The problem is that one can't forget about it. That exactly is the problem. It's the stickiness, the attachment involved that makes it difficult. So we need something a bit more useful than simply stop thinking about that. Don't be silly. Don't be silly. It's really a helpful phrase, isn't it? Right. Well, let's go through a general sort of schema for approaching this carrying of guilt. So we're now thinking of an example situation where you have done something wrong. You know you have done something wrong. That's the first step. The first step is to acknowledge, because even the first step is difficult, because what we see typically is with many human beings, including myself, is a wish to blame it on somebody else. It wasn't really me. It was the manager, or it was the government, or it was the bank, or it was the man next door, or I was misled by my wife or my husband, or whatever. So the first step, which, without that step, you're not going to get anywhere at all, really, is to acknowledge that, yes, it was wrong, and I am the one who did it. Gosh, it's so hard to do that, isn't it? Now, this isn't something that you don't stop there, because that's probably only going to increase the pain if you just, but without that acknowledgement, you can't move forward and make something positive out of it. So we don't want it to turn into something negative and carry it around. On the other hand, we don't want to stay with that acknowledgement and suffer the pain. So 1, acknowledgement. 2, somehow, in some way, there should be restitution. Restitution can take many different forms. One is to apologize, and to apologize with one's heart, not just some words, to apologize heartfully that I am sincerely sorry. Restitution takes that idea wider, where you can provide something for somebody to show that you are sorry by giving them something, taking them somewhere, doing something which is somehow replacing the negativity with positivity. Here is a gift to show that I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll take you on holiday to show that I'm sorry. Now, that has, of course, to be received in the right way, when one might not want to receive that from someone if one is still hurting a lot. But sooner or later, that hopefully will come about. So 3 would be some sort of remedial action, because, well, it depends on what it is that you've done. If you've deliberately broken somebody's tape recorder, then it might be a good idea to buy them a new tape recorder. So as a remedy, remedial action where helpful. 4, affirm that it will not be done again. To the best of one's ability, that one has learned from that, right, it won't happen again. And one has to mean it, of course. And one has to develop a sort of a strength to know that when the opportunity arises to do it again, you're not going to do it again, because you saw the pain that came out of it. So that will not happen again. if it does happen again, then you've got to go through this whole rigmarole again, and that someone will lose confidence in you. So number 4 is very important to deal with. 5, practice mindfulness. Surprise, surprise. Because mindfulness is a general technique in coming to be self-aware and of what's going through one's mind. What by mind we mean mind and heart, including one's emotional responses to things that one is a witness to that arising in you. And that it's not just you, it's human. All these things that you may think, it happened to me. Well, maybe you should add 8 billion other human beings to that tally, because this is the stuff that drama is made out of, or theatre is made out of, or great novels are made out of, isn't it? Betrayal of one's friend or one's partner or whatever. There's so much on that. So it's very, very human. Okay, so that's number 5. Now I'd like to, I know all that feels a bit heavy, and I'm sure there's probably everyone here recognizes it. So on a positive note, there's a great American poet, probably recognized as the greatest American poet, Walt Whitman. In a poem which is the size of a book, called Leaves of Grass. Now he's not a Buddhist, but he was quite sympathetic, unwittingly, to Buddhism. But just one little phrase from a poem of his, that when one is contemplating what one needs to do now in carrying this guilt and turning it into positive remorse, you have to have confidence in yourself. If you go around saying, well, I'm just a useless person and always getting in trouble and I can't help it. No, you say that, then you're making yourself something that you needn't be. So his phrase was in this poem, I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. I'll read that again. Just try to hold the whole thing. I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. Try it, in other words. Okay, there you go, with guilt and remorse. So lots for you to talk about, I'm sure. And I'll bring you back to Lynn there. Thank you, Lynn.
New Buddha Way lets go of East and West and starts afresh in the life we have now. For more information, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.